Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we have Rook Endgames, and this is going to be focusing on if there are two kings and you have your rook, how are you going to finish off the game? Well, this is possible. The only other way it is possible is if you have a queen, so only the rook and the queen can do it. If you had a king and a bishop versus a king, or a king and a knight versus a king, then this is impossible. But if you have a king and a pawn and you promote, you have to promote to a queen or a rook. So probably everyone's going to promote to a queen. But from a pawn, if you get to promote that, then most likely you're going to win. So you can also win the end game with the rook. So from here, this king needs to be checkmated. Well, what we need to do is we need to get this king into a tiny little box. We need to circle him off. So, the first move we play is h4. Rook to h4. So now, all these squares are cut off from the king. And now the king can't go any further up the board into any of these squares. He's just in this tiny box now, to any of these squares. So, the king moves to e3, trying to attack the rook, try to stay central. And we have king to c2, trying to get the king around to this side, which will force the king down, or the king will move down to f3. So, king to f3, and now we can either move in the king to d3, or we can bring the king to d2, or d1, which is not as efficient as d2 and d3, but it still works. Also, you could play a move such as you could swivel the rook all the way to b4, and this would still work, such as the same way as king to d1. It would still be a mate in 13. So now we have king to d3, which is the best possible move in the situation. And we have king to g3, so attacking this rook. Now the rook moves all the way to a4, and this king has a few boxes to work with, and that is f3, f2, g2, h2 and h3. It can't travel to any other squares because all these squares are isolated from the king because of this rook on a4. Now we have king to h3, and we're going to bring our king as close as possible to cut off this king's squares so we can get him into this corner to checkmate him, or anywhere down any of the files or any of the ranks at the edge of the board. So we have king to e3. King to g3, the king needs to move in as close as possible because he doesn't want to be checkmated on the h file. He doesn't want to be trapped. So he tries to do the best he can to escape. Now we have rook to f4. What this move does, it doesn't allow this king to come any closer down to these squares or these squares. This rook cuts off all these boxes from here, all these boxes down here, and the king is left with only these squares to go to. Every other square is unavailable for the king because of the rook and the king are teaming to force a box. Now we have king to g2 and rook to g4 with check. Now we have king to h3 trying to attack the rook. Now we need to defend our rook, either than moving our rook because it's better. Because if we move our rook all the way to a4 or a square such as d4, this would still end with checkmate, but we want to checkmate as fast as possible. If you're on low time on the clock, you want to think of the best moves to play. So what can happen here is we defend our rook by playing king to f3. So this defends the rook, and now this king is restricted to only a few boxes because this square is occupied by the rook. It controls all down here and all down these squares. So the king is left with these 3 squares to go to. The rest of the squares are covered by the king and the rook. Now we have king to h2. King to f2 mirroring the king. And what we can play is we can get the rook to h4, and the king won't be able to escape, and it will lead to checkmate. So now the best move to play is king to h3. So there is one of two moves to play. If king to h3 is mate in 2, if king to h1 is mate in 1. So if king to h1, then you're simply going to finish off the game with rook to h4, and that is a checkmate. And going back in this position, if the king tries to attack the rook with king to h3, there is many combinations to play. So you can move the rook anywhere along this file. You can move the rook to a4, you can move the rook to c4, d4, b4, f4, e4, any of those squares, and the rook will still be defended. And the rook will be safe. So from here, rook to a4, doesn't matter where you put the rook on this 4 file, unless it's away from the king. So from here, the king has one square, which is king to h2, and so what this rook to a4 was, it was a passive move to keep the rook on the 4 file, and the rook can slide back all the way along and finish off the game like this. So what that rook did was playing a passive move. You don't always have to rush to play your moves. You can always play passive moves, such as a waiting move, ready for the next move, and you finish off the game like this. So in this case, it was rook to a4, and the king had one square to go to. Then the rook could fly back in and finish the game like this. So the rook controls this h file, so this square, this square, this square, and the king can't move down to this square because of this king, this square because of the king, and this square because of the king as well. So all these squares are covered and the king is trapped, so this is a checkmate.